Okay, this is Federalist Era, uh, Part 8. All right, we're basically going to be looking at the first contested presidential election ever. That's going to be the election of 1796, the first one, which was a contest between opposing candidates. All but one of our elections since have been. The other one that wasn't was 1820. We're not up to that yet. All right, we've seen how our first two political parties came into being in the early to mid 1790s, how the Federalists, organized from the top down, um, started out as a congressional clique, made a bunch of contacts, never reached out for mass identification. Fatal error. All right. The Democratic Republicans organized from the grassroots up in the form of about 3 dozen local political clubs, all opposed to Hamilton, calling themselves either the Democratic Society or the Republican Society, those names being used interchangeably. Okay. What and they held off on networking. They were so opposed to political parties. They were more squeamish about coming together on that than the Federalists were, though the Federalists themselves did not plead guilty to being a party. Actually, these two groups, um, we would call them parties in retrospect, each accused the other of being a political party. In the culture at that time, that was a damning accusation. Okay. There was a controversial treaty that the Washington administration negotiated with the British government in 1795. And the Democratic Republicans, Jeffersonians in general, were fanatically opposed to it because they were very anti British, still held over from the Revolutionary War. Britain was at war with France, Revolutionary France, in which they placed great hope. Oh my. More on that later. Um, So, when John Jay, who I think had been the first Chief Justice, was sent over to London to try to negotiate a trade agreement, what he brought back was an agreement which would allow us to resume trade within the British Empire. Backstory on that: after the Revolutionary War was over, the British government then began waging a kind of economic warfare against the United States by freezing us out of trade within the British Empire. They could sell to us, they were not going to buy from us. They had this idea, actually written up in a pamphlet by some high standing Briton, that all they'd have to do to get the colonies back is to just force us up to the brink of bankruptcy, just freeze us out of trade within the empire, which had been 90% of our offshore trade before we became independent. They would reduce us to such poverty that we would come begging on our knees, meekly pleading to be readmitted to the empire. That's what they've been doing. Well, it hadn't worked yet, so the 1796 treaty, called the Jay Treaty after John Jay, J-A-Y, who negotiated it, came back and went before the Senate. Okay? And the Democratic and Republican societies organized and networked as never before to try to prevent it being from ratified. They failed. It did get ratified. Trade resumed presently. Prosperity returned for the first time in quite a while, and the treaty stopped being controversial. But when the dust settled and the smoke cleared, you have a second political party standing there ready to do battle in the political arena next time something came up, and it came up soon. This takes us to 1796, when President Washington announced that he would not be willing to serve a third term. He had accepted the second term with deep reluctance because Washington wanted very badly to set an example of a peaceful transition of power. Could he have been president for the rest of his life? Sure. He doesn't want to do that. He's afraid that if you set that example, then that'll spoil the whole thing, because every president thereafter who can keep getting elected indefinitely will do so. So he was afraid. See, he's not a young man anymore. He's over 60 years old, and his father and his half brothers had all died at relatively early ages. He's afraid he's going to do that too. So it's not death he's afraid of; it's death in office. So he comes back for the second term, And then the situation in Europe blew up when France plunged Europe back into war again, and Washington had to serve out the second term. He waited until September, maybe October, as the fall of the election was just on top of him, before he announced that he would not be available. I would say not a candidate, but we hadn't really had candidates yet. It's about to happen, but he never was a candidate. That's to put the Democratic Republicans, whom he distrusted, at a disadvantage. Federalists may have had some advance warning on this, but either way, the two political parties had to make it up on the fly. They're not tightly organized. There's no primaries. There's no convention. There are no delegates or anything like that. They're just the men who knew themselves to be the leaders, corresponding by mail and more or less reaching a consensus. The Federalists decided that they would back Vice President John Adams for president, and they thought to have a vice presidential candidate as well. That was a man named Pinckney from South Carolina. I'm not sure which Pinckney it was. They were very prominent at that time. And another Pinckney was the vice presidential nominee the next election. Neither one of them got it. The Democratic Republicans backed Thomas Jefferson, balancing the ticket with a New Yorker named Aaron Burr, who was he was a piece of work, shall we say. He was prominent, but not the most trustworthy man. He's the one who eventually killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel some years later. Okay, first contested election. Washington won unanimously in the Electoral College. There's not even records of a popular vote. A few states were allowing the states to choose the electors. That was not a big deal. Mostly state legislatures chose the presidential electors. It's the vice presidential part that went off the rails. Hamilton knew that he had Washington's ear. Washington was open to anything he wanted to do. Washington would back him in his plans. Adams, however, was practically an enemy. Hamilton did not get along with Adams. So Hamilton wants somebody besides Adams to be the president. So he intrigued behind the scenes to get electors, Federalist electors, to vote for somebody else besides Adams. He wasn't hoping Jefferson would win, although I think he might have preferred Jefferson. He wants to put it into the House of Representatives where he might, collect some IOUs and get somebody he could work with. It didn't work. All it succeeded in doing was keeping Washington's running mate from being vice president. In those days, this was changed after the in time for the 1804 election, actually, the 12th Amendment. Prior to that, each elector voted for two different people for president. Whichever one got the most electoral votes, as long as that's a majority of the total number of electors, is the president. Send him a letter and ask him if he's willing. Whoever got the second most, as long as that is a majority, would be the vice president. That could not possibly have worked if Washington's not around, except as handing the House of Representatives a slate of 5 men they could choose, or 5 candidates they could choose from. Because if nobody gets a majority, the House of Representatives, voting by states, immediately chooses a president from among the top 5. We've never had 5 electoral vote getters, maybe 4 one time. Okay, so Thomas Jefferson became president. That's where one party's nominee got to be president and the other party's nominee became vice president. Adams and Jefferson had been allies politically. They'd been close friends for years. Now they find themselves on the opposite sides of a bitter political divide, and they had a very awkward 4 years. And they contended against each other the next time around with the opposite outcome. Adams's term, France was ticked at us because we're supposed to be their ally, but we'd made a treaty with their enemy Britain. That didn't look good to them. And we had dared to elect the pro-British Adams instead of the pro-French Jefferson. So we got the quasi-war. That's where the French let loose whatever warships they had to capture American merchant vessels down in the Caribbean, and they captured a big bunch of them. That's a problem. And people wanted were starting to edge toward wanting war with France. Okay. Um, so Adams, I think, sent 3 delegates over to France to try to get an appointment with the French foreign minister, a man named Talleyrand, and he refused to meet with them personally. They got a lesson in how strong countries treated weak ones in those days. He sent 3 go-betweens, referred to in the report as Messieurs X, Y, and Z. Could be they didn't know how to spell their names. And they demanded a bribe, a huge bribe and a huge loan from our government to theirs. And our men just refused that. We didn't have that kind of money anyway. And the newspapers had all kinds of different accounts of what they said. Nobody really knew. But the one that sounded best was one of our delegates saying, "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute." Well, one of them stayed over there. The other 2 came back. One of them was Elbridge Gerry, for whom gerrymandering was later named, and another was John Marshall, soon to be the most influential Chief Justice in history. Okay, Adams released this report. The public is outraged. Demand for war just boiled over. Federalists are looking for, Democratic Republicans are practically looking for holes to hide in. And the Federalists had a majority in Congress, and they overplayed their hand, passing several alien acts, which you can read about in the supplement. And worst of all, the Sedition Act. Sedition is not a word we use anymore. It means encouraging resistance to lawful authority. And this made it a federal crime to criticize the government or hold government leaders up to ridicule. Okay, it was followed by a torrent of, prosecutions of Jeffersonian newspaper editors. So, how does this square with the First Amendment? Well, it doesn't. So Jefferson and Madison, practically in panic here, said, what do you do about a bad law? Nobody saw that coming. What if Congress passes a law that contradicts the Constitution? They didn't see it coming because they thought, the Constitution is written in plain language. They just wouldn't do that. But what if they do and the president signs it? Adams reportedly, according to some, signed the Sedition Act after reading a newspaper article characterizing him as a toothless, senile old woman. Now, Adams was short and fat and sensitive. Hand me the pen. So there we go. So Jefferson and Madison anonymously, their identities came out later, wrote pamphlets. Each one was adopted by a state legislature. They were called the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Madison wrote the Virginia resolution, which introduced a poisonous thing called the compact theory, which held that the Constitution is in effect an interstate compact. It's just an agreement among the states. They pre-existed the federal government, and therefore they can sit in judgment upon the federal government and determine when it has overstepped its authority. In other words, they could express the opinion that federal laws were unconstitutional, but they couldn't do anything about them. Jefferson was less squeamish. The Kentucky resolution, Kentucky accepted this, a new state, that states could not just express an opinion. A state could nullify a federal law. It could rule a federal law null and void and unenforceable within its boundaries. Well, if you do that, you're all the way back to worse than the Articles of Confederation. So that's where we're at going into the tumultuous election of 1800, which I like to refer to as the Great Screwed Up Election of 1800. And I'm going to stop this a few seconds early and do another video on that, and we'll be done with the Federalist Era.